My name is Meghan Fraser. Today I'll be talking a bit about tagging. We use the stupid tags though, not the smart ones. So I work for Homarus, which is the scientific branch of the Maritime Fishermen's Union. We have about 1,300 fishermen between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So we kind of work on projects that are of interest to the fishery because we work with the fishermen. And that's kind of where this project arose from. They wanted some information on the movement of lobsters in LFA 23, specifically 23B. If you're at all familiar with northern New Brunswick, you know that the subzones are there because of politics, not lobster populations. So basically what had happened was they were noticing some differences in their landings at their wharf in Caracat, Little Shippagan, and Niguac compared to some of their neighbors. And they wanted to know a little bit more about where the lobsters were moving. So we did a streamer tag study. We started using the DFO data that they had collected in the 80s and 90s as our reference. Michel Comeau was a huge influence on that. He's been very helpful. So you'll see me reference a lot of the study done in the 90s, and that's kind of my baseline for this project. So we were actually very fortunate. We were able to test our tagging technique in our lab at Homarus, and we were able to actually have one molt and retain the tag. So it was a really good way to kind of ground truth our technique. And then we went out last fall. We tagged about 3,600 lobster in northern New Brunswick. So as I mentioned, the base of our study was the DFO project. They had tagged 42,000 lobster, and they had a much wider range of sites. But we picked some that were of interest to us, and we used them as our baseline. Caracat, Little Shippagan, and Niguac were the ones of interest first, and then we went back last month and added some sites to our tagging study as well. But obviously a lot has changed since the 90s, largely water temperature. As you can see, this is a graphite board from DFO, just as a quick reference to show how in the 90s it was cooler and now it's warmer. There's also been a lot of changes to the management. In the 90s, LFA 23 was managed as one unified subzone. In about 2008, it was divided into 4 subzones. The legal minimum size was also a lot smaller. Today we're sitting at 81 and 79 millimeters. So there's a lot more protections involved. However, the subdivision of the LFA also it creates a little bit more tension between the areas. There's a lot of invisible lines drawn that the lobsters are not aware of. And that's part of the request from the fishermen was, my neighbors are catching my lobster, can you tell me where they're going and where they're coming from? Also, obviously, the landings have changed a lot since the 90s. In the mid-90s, they were at around 20,000 tons in the Southern Gulf, and they've pretty much doubled, and that holds true for LFA 23 as well, where they were around 4,000 tons to 9,000 tons today. And this is borrowed from the CSAS report. The data only goes up to 2021, however, the data is still very similar. So as I mentioned, we chose our 3 sites to start our project last fall. Caracat and Little Shippagan are in the same, is this a pointer? They're in the same area, but you don't know this, but the fishermen have an imaginary line there too, so that's why we chose 2 sites that were very close together to see how much exchange there was between the 2 sites. And Niguac, that's an interesting site as well because of the high prevalence of buried females. After speaking to Michel Comeau, his theory is that it's because of the influence of the fresh water from the Miramichi. But we also do at-sea sampling, and there is a large number of buried females there, and that's another question is how the movement is changing there. We asked our fishermen to either send us an email or we have a text to email. We didn't use our personal cell phones on that one either. That we kind of incentivized with a prize from Bass Pro. And we got a really good response, about 21% recapture and reported back to us. So of our 962 reports, 767 were unique tags. We had several that were caught multiple times. And the data points they don't show the recapture. Every point is an individual report. However, some of these are the same lobster caught a couple of times. So for Caracat, the average distance traveled was about 17 kilometers, and the max distance we had was 81 kilometers from this guy who moved out past Muskew and then came back in. The other interesting point is these lobsters over on the Gaspé side, the Baie des Chaleurs, it has a really deep basin here, so the most likely path of travel was actually kind of the long way around, either on that side or the other side. And that is something that they did not find in the 90s. After talking to Michel Comeau, he's pretty confident that nobody on the Gaspé side had picked up any of their tags. So this is also very new. The median distance was about 12.5 kilometers. And for Little Ship, again, the data was pretty much identical, as you would expect from pretty much the same area. Mean distance was 17, and the max distance was 82, but they went the other way. Same with the median distance, right around the same. Niguac was different. We had a smaller sample size there. Unfortunately, we were about a month too late, so they had already kind of dispersed. We only had about 455 lobster tagged in Niguac, so our reports were only about 75. Oops. So the maximum distance traveled in Niguac was 129 kilometers. If you're familiar with New Brunswick, that's almost to the Confederation Bridge. The mean distance was 20.9 and the median was around the same, 14.8. When we compare that to what they found in the 90s, we're almost, in some cases, more than double the distance, the average distance traveled. So in Caracat, in the 90s, they were traveling on average 8 kilometers, and our lobster were traveling 17. Same in Little Ship again, their lobster were traveling 8.7, and ours were 17.3. And then in Niguac, interesting result too, 14 in the 90s and 20.9 kilometers for us. So interesting as well. I'll show this on another slide, but the buried females were kind of our main cohort in Niguac. And there was a statistically significant difference between the distance the buried females and the males were traveling, where the buried females were actually going statistically significantly farther than the male lobster. And this is part of the work that we do. We also compare the, half my graph is missing. We also compare the frequency of our catch sample with the carapace length size. So you can see the majority of these lobster were market, and we had very few buried females. We had very few buried females. That's the same in Ship again as well. But in Niguac, we had a much larger proportion of buried females. We went back to Niguac about a month ago, and this was largely the result of the time of year. In September, we had a much more similar result to the other graphs. So as I mentioned, we started tagging in new sites this past year. Last month, we were out in LFAs 23A and C. We added 2 new sites. We were unfortunately a victim of timing again, where in Val-Comeau we were about a month too late. We only tagged about 300 lobster, but we did almost 2,000 in Petit-Rocher. We consolidated Caracat and Little Ship again into one site, and we returned and tagged an additional 1,400 lobster. And we also returned to Niguac and tagged an additional 1,500 lobster. And this is the more normal graph from Niguac on a typical, with a typical size distribution. We still see a large proportion of buried females compared to the other sites as well, but a much more normal. So yes, Cindy is here today. She was my partner on the water. We've been working on this for the last couple of years. Thank you to all the fishermen who obviously are part of the tags. And Michel Comeau was also a large mentor on this project. Thank you.
I'm curious about the buried female distribution and how it varies between the zones that you mentioned. It actually brings me to a presentation that I recall the CLRN events, where they were mentioning that they were finding ovigerous females buried in mud intertidal flats, potentially increasing the temperature exposure of their embryos, facilitating development. Wondering whether or not looking in any intertidal areas for your tags or buried females that have been tagged.
It's not something we do. We are really at the mercy of the commercial fishery for this one, but it is an interesting question. It's something that keeps coming up on, okay, why are there buried females? Especially, like, I'll go back. Yeah, especially in the Miramichi. It's kind of a weird spot to fish, so they go a little bit further out to get their to put their traps. So I guess we could start looking into some non-fishery related things like through scuba surveys, but the intertidal is kind of a gray area for us.
I was just more curious along the lines of, you were talking about the distribution of ovigerous females and whether or not, where they're choosing to bed themselves to increase that temperature exposure of their embryos. Just more of a curiosity when it comes to this tagging work as well.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
So just looking at that map specifically, I noticed your lobsters do go into LFA 25.
They do.
Did you guys collaborate at all with the PEIFA? Because they actually used a smaller version of my tag there.
Yeah, we've been in contact with them. So we're fortunate, if you're unaware, LFA 25 is a summer fishery. So we were able to get a large amount of reports in the spring, and then that continued into the fall, where we got, I think, all of these were in August, I believe. We did communicate with the PEIFA to say, hey, keep an eye out for our tags. We haven't received any reports that we know of that were specifically from PEI. It was kind of an anonymized, they text to email, so I got like a couple of 902 numbers, but I don't know if they were actually PEI fishermen or not. PEI is actually doing their own tagging study with these tags in LFA 24 as well. So yeah, it's great, thank you.
So the change in movement pattern is really interesting, going back to those historical data. To wildly hand wave and speculate here, if, for example, a historically nocturnal species suddenly has a whole day to work with, you might expect roughly double your chance to displace if you're active for 24 hours instead of 12. So I wonder if there's something that has shifted their temporal activity patterns as well. Do you guys have any data on what sort of potential threats or competitors might have been around historically versus now? Is that something like you could get from maybe bycatch data or something?
There's a bit of bycatch data. I don't know how far back it goes to that extent. I mean, there's obviously predators of lobster, but these are market lobster. They're not typically, like, there's no real large predator at the bottom that I would say for sure is a huge stressor. If anything now, it seems like with the seals and the bass, and there's a whole thing with that. But no, I don't know in the bycatch data. I can take a look and see if there's any other changes, but I think the abundance of lobster, the change in the landings, like from approximately 20,000 tons to 40,000 tons roughly, I think it's probably more of a, they're looking for a nice little rock to hide. I think maybe that might be a bigger factor.